In today's video, I'm going to talk about two stories, The Premature Burial and The Fall of the House of Usher. But more specifically, I want to examine how Poe uses his narrators to manipulate the reader, to hoax, to misdirect, to bewilder us, and he does this a lot in his stories. We've already seen in The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat, for example, how unstable and unreliable his narrators can be. But in these two stories, he goes a step farther. In The Premature Burial, the narrator tricks us into believing something happened, which really didn't, postponing the truth until the end of the tale. Then in The Fall of the House of Usher, Poe denies us that kind of easy closure. And by the time we reach the end of that story, we are never more uncertain about what's taken place. Do the fantastic events the narrator describes actually happen, or are they the product of his morbid and overexcited imagination? The Fall of the House of Usher was published in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1839, and it's one of several stories we'll read that also contain Poe's original poetry interpolated or embedded in the narrative. In the story, The Haunted Palace is a poem written by Roderick Usher. It's about a house that falls into ruin and is haunted by evil spirits, an apparent allegory for Roderick's descent into madness. But the poem was actually published 5 months before the story as a standalone piece by Poe in the American Museum of Science, Literature, and the Arts. The Premature Burial appeared 5 years later in the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper. I couldn't locate an open access copy of the paper for this lecture. What you see here is a microfilm print from the research files of Thomas Olive Mabbitt, archived at the University of Iowa. We've already seen the theme of premature burial in some of Poe's other stories, but he was hardly the only person writing about it. In fact, live burial had long been a topic of general public fascination. There was the story The Buried Alive, printed in Blackwoods in 1821 and mentioned to Suki Snobbs in How to Write a Blackwood Article. And in 1827, the Philadelphia Casket printed a piece titled The Lady Buried Alive, which provided a direct source for the story of Mademoiselle Lafourcade in Poe's story 17 years later. In 1839, the same year The Fall of the House of Usher appeared in Burton's, a British surgeon, George Alfred Walker, published Gatherings from Graveyards, an anthropological and medical treatise mainly concerned with how the disposal of the dead impacts public sanitation, but it includes a section on what he calls premature interment, in which he makes the following remark. The difference between the end of a weak life and the commencement of death is so small, and the uncertainty of the signs of the latter is so well established, that we can scarcely suppose undertakers capable of distinguishing an apparent from a real death. He follows this with several anecdotal cases of live burial, a pattern closely emulated by the narrator of The Premature Burial. Fear of being buried alive was commonplace enough that in late 1843, an inventor from Baltimore exhibited a so-called life-preserving coffin, the Bentley of American coffin manufacture. It was equipped with various safety features to assist anyone who should happen to find themselves in this terrible predicament. This coffin was reported on by Nathaniel Parker Willis in the New Mirror, a New York magazine, in November 1843. Then 2 months later, in January 1844, the poet Seba Smith reported on the coffin for the Columbian Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine. Her description of it contains many of the details later mentioned in Poe's story. In order to guard against the occurrence of a burial before life is extinct, the inventor has arranged springs and levers on its inside, whereby its inmate, by the least motion of either head or hand, will instantly cause the coffin lid to fly open. The inventor also advises families who may feel disposed to make use of his life-preserving coffins to have their tombs or vaults constructed with a lock upon the door that will open either from the inside or outside, and have a key to the lock left within the tomb. He would also have the tomb provided with a bell that would be rung by its inmates. Smith's brief note is followed by a sentimental poem and ballad measure that tells the story of a young woman who's buried alive and rescued when she alerts her grieving mother by pulling a bell rope from inside her coffin. Poe's story was published just 6 months later. Poe does mention the topic of live burial in some of the earlier stories that we've read. How to Write a Blackwood article, Loss of Breath, The Pit and the Pendulum come to mind, and it will come up again in The Fall of the House of Usher. And all of these stories, including Usher, appeared in print before the Premature Burial, but this story is his most sustained treatment of the theme. Poe often begins his stories with lengthy exposition that lays groundwork for events that happen later, and both these stories exhibit this characteristic move. But in the Premature Burial, the narrator's expository work splits the story into two roughly equal parts. In the first, he delivers a short disquisition on the topic of live burial. Then in the second part, he narrates his own experience with catalepsy and his fears of being buried alive. We therefore see two aspects of the same narrator. At first appearance, he is rational and scientific, but he later reveals himself to be mentally unstable and highly susceptible to irrational fears. We see the same thing with the narrator of The Fall of the House of Usher. So we'll take a look now at some of the themes and motifs of this story. We're going to start with live burial, monomania, some of these we've seen before, and manipulative narration. We're going to start with live burial. The narrator's first order of business in the story is to convince the reader not only that premature interment, and this is the same term, by the way, that Walker used in Gatherings from Graveyards, that premature interment really does happen, but that it might be even more commonplace than anyone realizes. And he does this first on moral grounds, arguing that the only reason any writer has to present before the public written accounts of horror and suffering is, and I'm quoting him here, when the severity and majesty of truth sanctify and sustain them. It is the fact, it is the reality, it is the history which excites. In short, then, legitimate fiction, as he puts it, is bound to the truth it instructs. If a story frightens or appalls the reader, it does so with a higher purpose, to teach us about the world, to show us how people really are. From here, he goes straight to the main topic. To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. With a very sober tone, he describes the boundaries which divide life from death as being at best shadowy and vague, and that cases of suspended animation may result in someone being buried alive. For the next several pages, he presents stories of persons who experience some medical crisis not recognized by their loved ones or physicians, who were then taken to be dead and placed in a family vault or buried in the earth, only to awaken afterwards and realize the horror of their circumstances. There are 4 of these interpolated stories, and in 3 of them, the person buried alive miraculously survives the experience. There's a French woman believed to be dead who's dug up by her grieving lover. He wants to retrieve a lock of her hair, but he instead becomes her rescuer and they immigrate to America. A soldier thrown from his horse manages to dig himself out of a shallow grave, only to be killed by the doctors treating him afterwards. Another man, Edward Stapleton is his name, is saved from suffocating in his grave when body snatchers or grave robbers dig him up to perform medical experiments. The topic of body snatching, by the way, appears in The Fall of the House of Usher as well. From these anecdotes, the narrator concludes there must be many more less fortunate individuals who do not escape or who are never rescued, and he imagines lingeringly and in disturbing detail what it must be like to suffer this fate. The unendurable oppression of the lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, the clinging of the death garments, the rigid embrace of the narrow house. The blackness of the absolute night, the silence like a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm, these things, with thoughts of the air and grass above, with memory of dear friends who would fly to save us if but informed of our fate, and with consciousness that of this fate they can never be informed, that our hopeless portion is that of the really dead. These considerations, I say, carry into the heart which still palpitates a degree of appalling and intolerable horror from which the most daring imagination must recoil. It is at this point that the narrator transitions to his own experience. What I have now to tell is of my own actual knowledge, of my own positive and personal experience, he says. This is the first of a series of misleading statements, the implication being that he has either discovered evidence of premature burial, recorded the testimony of someone who'd escaped the ordeal, or perhaps has gone through it himself. This last possibility comes into focus as he reveals a medical condition, an intermittent catalepsy, he calls it, with some spells lasting for weeks at a time, a condition that obviously makes it possible that he might be mistaken for dead and buried alive. The narrator's fear of this outcome develops into a morbid obsession, a monomania. I'll read a passage here. My fancy grew charnel. I talked of worms, of tombs and epitaphs. I was lost in reveries of death, and the idea of premature burial held continual possession of my brain. The ghastly danger to which I was subjected haunted me day and night. In the former, the torture of meditation was excessive, in the latter, supreme. When the grim darkness overspread the earth, then, with very horror of thought, I shook as the quivering plumes upon the hearse. It was with a struggle that I consented to sleep, for I shuddered to reflect that, upon awaking, I might find myself the tenant of a grave. And when, finally, I sank into slumber, it was only to rush at once into a world of phantasms, above which, with vast, sable, overshadowing wings, hovered, predominant, the one sepulchral idea. So powerful is this one sepulchral idea, he can't get a night's rest without suffering terrible nightmares. In one of these, a spectral figure comes to him, escorts him from his bedroom, and discloses the truth of how many individuals since the dawn of time have suffered this terrible fate. And to my mind, this passage is one of the most terrifying visions Poe ever put on paper. The fiend caused to be thrown open the graves of all mankind, and from each issued the faint phosphoric radiance of decay, so that I could see into the innermost recesses, and there view the shrouded bodies in their sad and solemn slumbers with the worm. But alas, the real sleepers were fewer by many millions than those who slumbered not at all, and there was a feeble struggling, and there was a general sad unrest, and from out the depths of the countless pits there came a melancholy rustling from the garments of the buried. And of those who seemed tranquilly to repose, I saw that a vast number had changed, in a greater or less degree, the rigid and uneasy position in which they had originally been entombed. After describing this nightmare, the narrator seems increasingly unstable. Fantasies such as these, presenting themselves at night, extending their terrific influence far into my waking hours, my nerves became thoroughly unstrung, and I fell a prey to perpetual horror. He becomes paranoid, suspicious even of his most intimate friends and associates, and takes the precaution of remodeling the family vault and procuring a life-preserving coffin. And yet, despite all of these red flags indicating a volatile and unreliable mental state, he still manages to fool most readers with his account of being buried alive. So this is where we're going to talk about manipulative narration, and he manages this manipulation with a strategically placed lie. Having taken all the precautions necessary to survive and escape from his grave, should it ever come to that, he states, and this is at the top of page 365, not even these well-contrived securities sufficed to save from the uttermost agonies of living inhumation a wretch to these agonies foredoomed. Following this statement, and for the next 6 paragraphs, he gives a detailed account of his experience being buried alive, while knowing from the very outset that none of it really happened, something he admits to us only after he has finished his harrowing description. But for now, he wants us to believe that it did happen so that we may experience not only the same terrors he felt at the time, but also the same shock and relief when he finally realized the truth, that he had only suffered one of his catatonic spells while lying in a tight berth on a boat and forgotten where he was. The seed for this idea is planted by the narrator earlier in the story in his description of the side effects of his catatonia, which apparently include short-term memory loss. I have a passage I'll put up on screen here. Apart from the tendency to trance, however, my general health appeared to be good. Nor could I perceive that it was at all affected by the one prevalent malady, unless, indeed, an idiosyncrasy in my ordinary sleep may be looked upon as superinduced. Upon awaking from slumber, I could never gain at once thorough possession of my senses, and always remained, for many minutes, in much bewilderment and perplexity. The mental faculties in general, but the memory in especial, being in a condition of absolute abeyance. The final punchline is that at the very beginning of the story, the narrator defended tales like this one on the grounds that they have what he calls an interest profound, an interest which, through the sacred awe of the topic itself, very properly and very peculiarly depends upon our conviction of the truth of the matter narrated. And yet, in the end, not only has the narrator deviated widely from the truth, and done so deliberately for the express purpose of unnerving his readers, he now confesses that his consumption of such reading material all this time was the primary contributor to his mental disorder, and he reframes the entire narrative as a cautionary tale, an ironic admonishment to the reader. My soul acquired tone, acquired temper. I went abroad. I took vigorous exercise. I breathed the free air of heaven. I thought upon other subjects than death. I discarded my medical books. I read no fusting about churchyards, no bugaboo tales such as this. In short, I became a new man and lived a man's life. From that memorable night, I dismissed forever my charnel apprehensions, and with them vanished the cataleptic disorder, of which, perhaps, they had been less the consequence than the cause. The Fall of the House of Usher is a more difficult story than the Premature Burial, in part because the narrator does not intentionally manipulate the reader. Rather, he seems to believe that the events of the story, as he describes them, are absolutely true, even as certain details that he provides would seem to indicate otherwise. The result is an exceedingly ambiguous story that from start to finish keeps readers suspended in a liminal zone between reality and hallucination, between sober reason and frenzied imagination, between exterior supernatural agency and interior madness. It's hard to know for sure what really happens. For some readers, the house is a malign force, a kind of monster that consumes everyone who sets foot within its walls, and then in the end literally swallows up Roderick Usher and his sister Madeline. For others, it's not the house, but its inhabitants who are irreclaimably deranged, and the most terrifying moments in the story, the climactic storm, Madeline's bloody resurrection, the breakup and collapse of the house, never happen as described, but are merely the caprices of a reckless, overstimulated, extravagant imagination. Of these two positions, I lean more towards the second one, but the truth seems to lie somewhere in between, a middle region that Poe never fully reveals, a boundary he never clearly draws. To some degree, then, the story becomes what we want it to be, a reflection of our own beliefs, our own fears, our own desires, even our own reading preferences and prejudices. And I think that's what makes this a great piece of narrative art and the quintessential Poe tale. There are a number of points of entry into the House of Usher, but I'm going to begin with Roderick Usher and his mysterious, debilitating mental condition, which is the reason the narrator, a childhood friend of Roderick's, has been summoned to the house in the first place. At the base of Roderick's psychological malady is an extreme hypersensitivity, with his unnatural sensations described as follows. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments, which did not inspire him with terror. It is his tendency to be overwhelmed by sensory stimulation, even mundane sensations that wouldn't trouble an ordinary person, that shapes Roderick's perception of the house, convincing him that it is somehow alive, that there's some mysterious, morbid connection between them, that the house somehow imposes its structure on his mind, and that his mind is part of the structure of the house. And this psychic reciprocity terrifies him. The period will sooner or later arrive, he says, when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear. The narrator describes Roderick's preoccupation with the house in at least two places. The first of these is on page 204. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, and whence, for many years, he had never ventured forth. An influence which some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit. An effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets, and of the dim tarn into which they all looked down, had at length brought about upon the morale of his existence. And again later, after Roderick's recitation of the poem The Haunted Palace, the narrator resumes this topic, and this is on page 209. I lack words to express the full extent or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected with the grey stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been here, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of the collocation of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as in that of the many fungi which overspread them, and of the decayed trees which stood around, above all, in the long, undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, and I here started as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Two remarks should stand out in this passage. First, the last sentence. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. What the narrator seems to imply here is that Roderick's ideas are outrageous, too crazy to be taken seriously by any sane person, and that he expects the reader to agree with him. And yet, a little past the halfway point in this passage, something Roderick says strikes the narrator. There's a parenthetical insertion. I here started as he spoke. So the narrator starts, he flinches, he recoils in response to something in Roderick's description of the house. The evidence of its sentience, Roderick says, is in the condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. Throughout the tale, in his dealings with Roderick, the narrator tries to remain rational, calm, and dispassionate, hoping to serve as an equipoise to his less stable friend, to release him from the phantasm fear. And yet, at the beginning of the story, when he first arrives at the house, before he's even had an opportunity to speak with Roderick in person, the narrator witnesses the mysterious condensation, which he dismisses not as a ghostly presence hovering over the house, but as the product of his own imagination, overstimulated by the dank and dismal appearance of the edifice. With the first glimpse of the building, he says in the opening paragraph, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit, an iciness, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought. Sickening thoughts, which he says are brought on not by malevolent forces, but simply by the influence of unpleasant sensations. There are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, he concludes. This effect is amplified when he tries to reverse it by looking away from the house. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant and eye-like windows. From this experience, he advances a theory of terror that has nothing to do with supernatural agency, but with the natural operations of the mind. Fear, he says, has a compounding effect. Its intensity increases with our awareness of it, and the more we resist, the stronger it gets. And here's another lengthy passage that's worth taking a close look at. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such, I have long known, is the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as a basis. And it might have been for this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Here the narrator seems in control. He dismisses this pestilential vapor as superstitious, ridiculous, a strange fancy, and he puts forward a plausible theory for how the mind, overstimulated by unpleasant sensory impressions, could play such unpleasant tricks. One line that stands out especially to me is the vivid force of sensations which oppressed me. If it's true that the house, in its eerie, dilapidated condition, could have this oppressive influence on his mind, then what about his friend? Could Roderick have this oppressive influence upon him as well? The more time the narrator spends with him, gazing for hours on his nightmarish paintings, reading morbid books in his library, and listening to his weird music, it begins to seem that he is not having the positive effect Roderick was hoping for when he invited him into his home. As a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the narrator says, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. What finally pushes the narrator over the edge is the death of Roderick's sister, Madeline, whom he sees only once for a few seconds without a single word passing between them. Roderick explains that she suffers from a mysterious wasting disease of a partially cataleptical character, like the narrator of the Premature Burial, and she dies, we're told, within days of the narrator's arrival at the house. Fearing that her grave could be desecrated by medical men and her corpse violated for their experiments, this is the fate of Edward Stapleton in the Premature Burial, Roderick decides to keep her temporarily in the house, and the circumstances of her entombment bear slow and careful reading. I'm going to let you all do that on your own in preparation for class discussion. With Madeline supposedly deceased, Roderick's mental condition declines precipitously, but it's his influence on the narrator that should draw our attention. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me, by slow yet certain degrees, the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. I think this might be the most important sentence leading into the frenzied climax of the tale. It raises questions about everything that happens next, the sudden, weirdly violent storm, Madeline's improbable Houdini-like escape from the vault, the rapid disintegration of the house. Are these real events? Are they partially real, or are they entirely imagined by the narrator? For class discussion, I want you to reread the end of the story, paying particular attention to what Roderick and the narrator read together and the effect it has on their minds and their perceptions of their surroundings. And I want you to consider as well whether Poe is making a statement about his own readers, about how we read and respond to a story that, at its most dramatic and appalling moment, is a story about the very act of reading. The edition of Poe you see behind me in this video, this was the first copy of Poe I ever owned. It was purchased for me by my grandma for Christmas back in 1984. She got it at Walden Books. It's the best cover art for a trade edition of Poe I've ever seen. My lengthy analysis of these two stories was necessary just because of how complicated Poe's narrators can be, and we're going to see the same kinds of narrative problems in later stories. In particular, I'm thinking of William Wilson and Ligeia. So keep that in mind, and that concludes this video.